So, you want to start an airline in Australia? Well, I'm here to tell you, you might as well give up now. Let's look at what you need. First off, you're going to need a plane. And you're trying to launch an airline, not a flight, so you're going to need more than one. But you can't just walk into the plane store and walk out with a fleet. They take years and years to build. And there are backlogs at the two big manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus, meaning nothing's going to really be delivered before 2030. And that's assuming you can afford to pay the upfront cost of about $100 million per plane. But you don't want to launch an airline in 2030, you want to launch one yesterday. So you're going to need to rent your planes. And given their scarcity, it's pretty darn expensive to lease them these days. So you've rented some expensive planes. Next, you're going to need people to pilot and staff them. Getting enough pilots might be tricky. Good pilots will often get poached by larger airlines, whether it's in Australia or internationally. So you'll have to invest in training new pilots. When it comes time to actually fly one of your planes, you'll need fuel. It's one of the biggest single operating costs for an airline. And unless you can see into the future, you'll have to guess whether it's more affordable to buy up big on fuel today or wait a while. And so if you've already paid top dollar for your leased planes, your pilots, and your petrol, you're going to be hoping your flights are jam-packed with passengers if you've got any hope of making that money back. And to have a packed flight, you want to fly a busy route, which means Sydney to Melbourne. One of the busiest routes, not just in Australia, but in the world. Okay, so your new airline flies Sydney to Melbourne and the customers and cash start rolling in. Except, not so fast. Your planes can't actually fly to or from Sydney Airport. Because it's close to the city, Sydney Airport legally has to minimise the noise for people living nearby. That means a curfew from 11 PM to 6 AM, and during the day, a cap of 80 takeoffs and landings an hour. These movements are known in the industry as slots. So how does an airline get a slot? You have to ask the company that manages them. Slots are free, but there's only a finite number of them, and they're given out on a first-come, first-served basis. Qantas, and by extension its budget carrier Jetstar, have existed for ages, so they have a lot of the slots already. And Virgin got lucky by getting the slots freed up when Ansett went bust. And those slots are the airlines to keep, unless they fail to utilise them more than 20% of the time. Oh, and the company that manages the slots is majority owned by Qantas and Virgin. If you think that seems unfair, you're not alone. The heads of competing airlines, as well as airports across the country, have accused Qantas and Virgin of doing something they call slot hoarding. This is where airlines schedule more flights than they actually plan on operating, then strategically cancel them to keep their cancellation rate below 20%, so they don't have to give up any of their slots to challenger airlines. Now, Qantas and Virgin strongly deny that they engage in slot hoarding.
So Qantas is in a position where it's had 11 of the last 12 months, the lowest level of cancellations overall of any major carrier.
But even Sydney Airport is up in arms about this. They point to a cancellation rate on the Sydney-Melbourne route of nearly 10% by Qantas and Virgin in some months, when there are other months where Rex cancelled no flights at all on the route. Now, it might seem like a tiny part of the whole operation of running an airline, but without access to Sydney Airport, your dream is running on fumes. Don't just take my word for it. The former competition watchdog chair, Rod Sims, had this to say about the slot system.
The government sets this system up for failure. It sets this system up for a duopoly, and therefore sets the system up for higher aviation, for higher airline prices than Australians should be paying.
Just look at what happened to others who've attempted to challenge the Qantas-Virgin duopoly before. Bonza offered cheaper airfares to regional destinations, but they weren't able to get access to Sydney Airport at peak times, which are the most profitable. So they never flew to Sydney. And on the routes from cities they actually did fly, they rarely packed out their flights. They also couldn't get that many planes, which meant they couldn't run services as frequently, which made them a less reliable choice for holidaygoers. And it didn't help that Bonza was flying larger planes than it probably needed to, or that there were serious concerns about the business practices of Bonza's owners around the world. In April 2024, just over a year after launching, Bonza's in-demand jets were repossessed abruptly, the airline went into administration, and it's now officially dead. And then there's Rex. It's been around since 2002, but for most of its life, it's just been flying these old school 36-seater planes to regional towns. Now that changed during COVID, when the airline industry was in crisis and bigger 737 jets were going for relatively cheap. So Rex leased a few and managed to get some slots at Sydney Airport. And even though they weren't able to get too many of those prized peak time slots, they kept expanding their major city flights across the country. Now Rex's growth made a big impact. Consumer watchdog monitoring found airfares got cheaper on the routes where Rex is competing. And because Rex needed to make its money back on the huge cost of leasing its planes, it had one of the lowest cancellation rates in the country. Now, Rex claims Qantas then hit back by competing on their regional routes, where Rex had once been the only operator. Qantas flew bigger planes, which hiked the small town airport's operating costs, because they suddenly required things like expensive security scanners, and those costs were passed on to Rex as well. Rex claimed this added as much as 30% of the cost to some of their tickets, while Qantas, which has been posting record profits, could undercut them and absorb those losses. And Rex just couldn't compete and actually had to cut some of its regional services, which had been its bread and butter. And so in August, it all came crashing down for Rex. So seeing as it all comes down to an airline being able to fly the major lucrative routes, why aren't laws changed to increase competition in Australia's aviation industry? Well, the Albanese government will tell you it has done plenty of things to boost aviation competition, but many experts are wondering what those things are. In fact, the recommendations from a government-ordered review into Sydney Airport have been sitting on a government desk since 2021, since the Morrison government. And while Labor has now planned some tweaks to Sydney Airport's laws and released its grand aviation white paper for big picture reforms to the industry, there's no golden change that will make the prospect of starting a new airline more feasible. After all, this is a government that let Bonza die without jumping in, and says Rex was foolish to try and expand beyond its regional flights. For decades, plenty have said that Australia is just a two-airline town, and there's a large chunk of the aviation industry that doesn't really think the federal government is hugely inclined to dispel that assumption. Right after Rex went into administration, the government did announce it would look to get a new impartial Sydney Airport slot manager. But in practice, it'll just be a new group controlling the same arguably broken system that is giving the green light to major airlines to keep their slots so long as their cancellation rate doesn't reach 20%. So unless there's a dramatic rethinking of how access to the tarmac here at Sydney Airport is handed out, your dreams of launching Australia's third major airline are probably destined for lost baggage.